The deadly fog. There's something primal in the human fear of fog. It's the uncertainty, the way the world shrinks into a hazy blur, leaving only muffled sounds and an eerie, pale void. For the town of Grimsby, nestled on the edge of a silent, swamp-ridden forest, fog was just another part of life, rolling in with the seasons. But for as long as anyone could remember, there were certain nights when no one ventured out. On these nights, the fog was different, a thick, pulsating mist that clung to the ground like living flesh. They called it the deadly fog. No one knew why or when it had started. Generations had passed down stories of townspeople disappearing without a trace when the fog crept in. They'd leave home and never return. Only shadows on the road and faint echoes of last footsteps lingered as reminders of the ones claimed by the fog. Despite the warnings and legends, in recent years, people had started to forget. They dismissed the tales as superstition, the fog merely a remnant of the marshy lands around them. But that was about to change. The night it returned, I was working late at the small diner on Main Street. My name is Eleanor Moss, born and raised in Grimsby. I'd grown up hearing the stories and even joined my parents in some of the old rituals designed to keep the fog at bay. But as an adult, I dismissed it all. No one I knew had ever disappeared in the fog, after all. But that night, something was wrong. The air felt thick and damp, carrying an unusual chill. Around midnight, my friend Harry stumbled in, his face pale as a sheet, eyes wide with terror. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost. "Ellie, it's here." I saw it. His voice was barely a whisper. I raised an eyebrow, more amused than concerned. "Saw what?" He swallowed, glancing out the window. "The fog. But not just any fog, it's that one. The fog they warn us about." I rolled my eyes. "Oh, come on, Harry. It's just a bit of mist. You know how the weather is here." But Harry shook his head vehemently. "No, Ellie. This isn't normal. Isvi erisoviti." It was like something was in there moving, like shadows or something. The way his face twisted in horror made me pause. Something about his expression clawed at a deeply buried memory, a long-forgotten fear. And as if on cue, a gust of wind swept against the windows, rattling them violently. Outside, the night had thickened with a dense fog that pooled low to the ground, swallowing the streetlights. A cold dread washed over me. We quickly locked the doors and dimmed the lights, peeking out the windows at the thickening fog. Harry sat across from me, his hands trembling as he held his coffee, his eyes flicking back and forth, as if expecting something to appear. We weren't alone. Grimsby's fog had a life of its own, an intelligence. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional, almost imperceptible sounds from outside, soft whispers, or perhaps footsteps, faint and ghostly. My heart pounded, every beat loud and heavy. And then I saw it, there in the street, just beyond the reach of the diner's dim lights. A shape moved. It was a figure, human-shaped but wrong. It was shrouded in shadow, like a silhouette smeared against the pale gray of the fog. I held my breath, unable to move, as the figure glided forward, disappearing and reappearing in the mist. "Do you see it?" I whispered, voice barely audible. Harry nodded, his face drained of color. I think it's looking for someone." We huddled in silence, watching as more figures emerged from the fog, each one drifting aimlessly, their forms distorted. Some seemed like children, others elderly, and they moved with a slow, methodical grace. They didn't speak, only moved closer, their faces blank, eyes hollow. In the quiet, I remembered the stories, the ones about the fog, not just hiding people, but absorbing them, consuming them until they became part of it. They would be neither alive nor dead, forever wandering within the mist, lured back to Grimsby whenever the fog rolled in. Suddenly, one of the figures turned its head sharply toward the diner, as if sensing us. It started moving closer, gliding across the ground like smoke. My pulse quickened, panic clawing at me. "Harry, we need to go. Now!" But before we could move, the diner's front door rattled violently, as if someone or something was trying to get in. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the floor, and I could feel a strange pressure building in the air, a force pushing against the walls. Harry grabbed my arm. "The back door, come on!" We sprinted through the kitchen, flinging open the back door and stumbling out into the cold night air. The fog was thick here too, rolling around us like living, breathing smoke. We clung to the wall of the diner, trying to stay out of sight. The street was eerily quiet. The figures we'd seen earlier were now nowhere to be found, and for a moment I almost dared to hope that we'd imagined it all. But the silence was too heavy, too unnatural. It was the kind of silence that pressed into your ears, drowning out even the sound of your own heartbeat. And then we heard it, a faint, distorted whisper, like a voice calling from far away. I couldn't make out the words, but there was an urgency, a desperation that sent chills down my spine. The fog swirled around us, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was one of the figures, barely visible through the mist. It was different from the others, though. Its face was partially visible, gaunt and pale, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Harry tugged at my arm. "Ellie, let's go." But I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from the figure. It drifted closer, its eyes fixed on me, and in that moment, I felt a strange, sickening pull, as if it were trying to draw me in, to make me part of the fog. I stumbled back, breaking the spell, and we ran, our footsteps echoing in the silent, empty streets. We didn't stop until we reached the old church at the edge of town. It was one of the few places that had always been considered safe, a sanctuary against whatever dark forces haunted Grimsby. We pushed open the heavy doors and collapsed inside, gasping for breath. The church was empty, save for the faint flicker of candlelight near the altar. I looked around, half expecting to see more figures lurking in the shadows, but the air was still, and the fog seemed to stop just outside the doors. We huddled together, shivering from the cold and the fear. Harry looked at me, his eyes wide with terror. "Ellie, what's happening? Why now? Why tonight?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something ancient and malevolent had returned, something that had been waiting for this moment. The fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was alive, a predator that hunted in silence, swallowing anyone who crossed its path. And as we sat there in the dark, a thought occurred to me, a memory from the old stories my grandmother used to tell. She'd once mentioned that the fog was drawn to certain people, people who carried a darkness within them. It fed on fear, on guilt, on secrets. I glanced at Harry. and a sickening realization washed over me. We had both been drawn to Grimsby, both lured back here after years of trying to escape. And now, the fog had come for us, drawn by the shadows we'd tried to leave behind. The night dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. The fog pressed against the church doors, swirling and shifting, but it couldn't cross the threshold. We were safe, for now, but I knew we couldn't stay there forever. At dawn, the fog began to dissipate, thinning into wisps that slowly faded into the morning light. The town was silent, the streets empty, and the figures we'd seen the night before were nowhere to be found. But the fear lingered, a heavy weight that clung to us, reminding us of the horrors we'd witnessed. In the days that followed, life in Grimsby returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. But the townspeople were different, their faces haunted, their voices hushed. No one spoke of the fog, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the silent understanding that it would return. As for me and Harry, we left Grimsby as soon as we could, vowing never to return. But the memory of that night stays with me, a dark shadow that haunts my dreams. And every time I see fog rolling in, I feel a chill run down my spine, a reminder of the deadly mist that waits in silence, biding its time. Because I know that one day it will come for me again, and this time I won't be able to escape.